Everybody, Brian Beckcom here, and I have got Anders Indset. Anders and I think about a lot of the same topics. I'm super duper excited about this show. Anders is a futurist. He's a Norwegian born philosopher. He is very, very into tech. He's into the future. He's into quantum computing. He's into philosophy, what it means to be human. He's into one of my favorite topics. In fact, the topic probably that for the last 5 or 6 years has fascinated me the most. What is consciousness? What's its purpose? How does it arise? And how does it interplay with the coming AI revolution? And so I'm really, really, really excited about this show. Anders, how you doing, man? Thanks for coming on the show today.
Brian, thank you for having me. Pleasure to be on your show.
You're in Germany right now?
I'm in Germany, Frankfurt, Germany.
Nice. So, and you were born in, it says on your bio, you were Norwegian born. Where were you
Yeah,
born? Were
sure.
you born in Norway?
Yeah, born in Norway. Grew up in Norway. Was born in Trondheim, which is kind of like a bigger city in Norway, only though it has about 180,000 people. Spent a lot of my time in a small mining town called Røros, knitted in on the borderline to Sweden. Very cold in the winter time with only about 3,500 people. Spent my school years from 12 to 17 there, and had a year and a half in Nebraska in the US. So been moving around a little bit. Past 25 years, been in Germany.
Nice. I'll bet Nebraska and Germany are a little bit different, both from a cultural and a language standpoint, and probably a climate standpoint too. Well, tell everybody, if you don't mind, spend a little bit of time telling everybody about who you are, where you come from, and kind of what you have a very eclectic set of interests. Tell everybody a little bit about, for example, some of your writing and some of your work.
Yeah,
But
sure.
start by telling us a little bit about your background.
Yeah, I'll you said it, interest at a variety of fields. That's always been my driving force. I've been very, very passionate about, learning new stuff. I discovered the beauty of progress. The experience of your own experience of learning something new, at a very early stage. And it's been a driver throughout my life. I was a professional athlete. Played sports here in Europe, in Norway, and in Germany. Set up my first companies, had a communication agency, built an online print house, and started to invest in some smaller tech companies. Was very curious about the first and the second wave of the internet. Did some programming and got into the nitty-gritty, and wanted to learn about what's underneath or behind the screen. So that was always a driving force. I was very interested in reading. So when we had our away games and doing the sport, I was the one reading on the way over and the one running the microphone on the way back. So there was the diversity and the mixture was always a big drive. And after a while, I was a hardcore capitalist, chasing the finite goals and living a lot out of confirmation from the outside world, extrinsic motivative drive, and I kind of sort of didn't feel success. So I sold up my companies and started to dig deeper into philosophy. I always was very curious about the relationship between philosophy or the academical part of philosophy with the business world, because I saw a lot of the philosophical questions that were tackled and challenged from a lot of the German philosophers 250 years ago. I saw them arising also on the board, board roles on the tables of the meetings of large corporations. So that was a very interesting, path to go down, and also in relation to technology. As I said, I was very interested about, emerging technologies, a lot about the exponentiality and the potential future implications on humanity. So I started to write and speak at a lot of conferences, and I've just finished my sixth book, The Viking Code, which is basically a short, autobiography in the first part, tackling the art and science of Norwegian success. So it's more about, how to build a high performance culture rooted in values. It's a broader book for a broader audience. And I've just also wrapped up a book that will be out next year with a quantum physicist friend of mine, Florian Neukert. It's titled Singularity Paradox: Bridging the Gap Between humanity and AI. So the past 15 years, I've done a lot of writing, various papers and 6 books now, and spoken at a lot of conferences. And today, I'm also more and more investing in deep tech companies, smaller equity shares through my investment company, to try to like also see the ideas and the thoughts that I have brought to life. Because to me, philosophy is a thinking practice. So I want to see
Yeah.
my thoughts come to life. So that's in a short overview over the different path that I've gone through and gone down the past 20 years.
What kind of athlete were you? What sport did you play?
So I played team handball. So it's
Nice.
yeah, it's not a sport that is very known to a American public. That's it's kind of a mixture between basketball and soccer, one could say. You throw the ball to goal. It's a very team-related sport. You run some plays, kind of like football. And you play 7 against 7. I have a
Nice.
goal, 6 players. And it's a very fast-paced game. So that was, I mean, I did a variety of sports because growing up in a small town, I had to show up for all the other ones if they want to come to play in my, favorite sport team. So that was the essence of the collectivism and, understanding that we need that, unity. So that was so always very interested in sports. I liked basketball and American football. And when I lived in the States, that was a big part of also my journey in Nebraska, obviously, very close to football. So I've always liked a lot of sports, and until even today, I'm very interested and follow a variety of sports, and that's why it brought me back to that Norwegian success. A small country with only 5.5 million people that has given birth now to some athletes that are at the pinnacle of some of the largest sports disciplines in the world: golf, tennis, soccer, running, and that to me was very, very interesting phenomena. So that's why I wrote the book, The Viking Code, as a book in between, the thing that we started to talk about, the technology and the philosophical part and all the reflections on consciousness. So yeah, that's what I've been up to, Brian.
So that's another thing that you and I have in common. I was a college basketball player at, in
Oh,
the
really?
United States we call it a Division I basketball player. So played at a
Oh,
pretty high level. And then I've been an athlete. I'm 52 years old, purple belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. I train every day. And I was the guy on the team bus like you back when I was 20, 21 years old. Everybody else is listening to rap music. And I'm reading a book by Plato or Aristotle or Nietzsche or something like that. And so I've joked with people. I say I'm an athlete, but I'm also a nerd. And so it
I
sounds like
like
you're
that. Yeah, I like that. I like that. I
yeah.
like that. I like that nerdy part. I dug into the code and I was writing, I remember the first years of HTML, and you got the image tag, and it was very simple. Like it wasn't like a deep
Oh
programming.
yeah.
It was just the birth, of that emergence of putting through the internet some kind of visual representations of ideas onto this new medium. And yeah, I've always been, nerdy and techie in that sense. So it seems like we have a lot of in common. But respect and kudos to your D1 basketball. That's amazing. Where were you playing? Were you playing?
I played at Texas A&M University,
Oh,
which
really?
is
Wow.
yeah,
Wow.
which
Yeah.
is a school down here in close to Houston where I
Yeah.
live. Well, and when I was in college studying computer science, this was the early 90s, Anders. And so there was really no internet. The internet had just come out. It was a government actually initiated, a US government initiated thing. But I remember programming on Unix workstations. I remember the first chat rooms. I had an email address in the early 90s, but it wasn't any good because nobody else had one. So there was nobody to email. I remember I remember programming computers in hexadecimal, which for people that aren't computer scientists, maybe the best way to explain it is at the very, very, very lowest level, computers are at least traditional computers. And I want to talk about quantum computers in a little bit, Anders, but traditional computers are run by the binary code, ones and zeros. But those binary codes can be represented in a language that's called hexadecimal. And so I was like literally programming the bits individually to turn on and off. I look now, Anders, at some of these programming languages, and it's amazing to me how we've built on top of the programming languages that I used to do. So now you can literally drag and drop chunks of code and they're pre-written and you don't have to do the same kind of work that I used to do, which I think you used the word earlier, exponential growth. That's part of the exponential growth that we're talking about. But I'll tell you what I'd like to do if it's okay with you. I'd like to talk a little bit about the Viking Code first, since I think, as you said, that book is a little more accessible to a little bit broader audience. And then, if it's okay with you, I'd like to talk a little bit about your upcoming book. I am fascinated by the singularity, by quantum technology. So, for people that might not be familiar with the singularity is this idea that at some point, machine and human intelligence will essentially merge. I mean, is that a good way to put it? Ray Kurzweil talks about this a lot, where machine intelligence will just it'll literally be an instant where human intelligence is essentially irrelevant. That's kind of the way I understand it. But let's talk about the Viking Code first. Tell us about you talk about the Norwegian success story, which I think is really, really worth talking about. So tell us the basic hypothesis of the Viking Code.
Yeah, so I mean that when I started to, I was like asking myself, how is it that a country like my home country, Norway, that does not really put that high performance culture at the top, but has been a country of collectivism and kind of sort of, enjoying nature and spare time and going to the cabins and yeah, obviously good in winter sport because we have snow, but they haven't really had that individualist driven mentality. So we look at the US, the Declaration of Independence and this, the
Yeah.
hero story and the journey. And all of a sudden we have all these particularly young men that all of a sudden rise to the top of these sports. So I was curious about that, and I called a friend of mine. He's a trainer coach in Norway for a lot of the people that are been to the Olympics and various disciplines. He's an athlete coach, and I want you to like see and look behind. I haven't done a lot of sport myself. You had various thoughts and systems and reflections on how to build a high performance team or how to to improve your skills. But I was curious about, is there some kind of magic to this that has now arisen over the past 10, 15, 20 years? And as I started to write about that together with my colleague and think about it, I discovered what the book was actually about. And that was that they were not only the best at their game, but they were also the most liked. So even though they were individualists and did individual sports, they were, cherished and loved and very, in terms of fair play, they were team players in all facets of the game, in the local culture, the community, and even with their competitors, the referees. They liked these Norwegian modern Vikings in everything they did. So I said, this is interesting because that seems like a contradiction. How can you build a high performance culture that is rooted in values? So that became the kind of the underlying story of the book. And I think it's really timely today. We have spoken a lot about, hard work and performance. Is not a good thing. We should work less, and people become exhausted and tired to the optimization of being driven by, social media and algorithms. How do you live an active life? And the essence of individualism has always been like, you have to destroy someone else. You have to win at a finite game, take up a lot of space. You're not seen as that collective spirit that uplifts all the other ones. And that to me was very fascinating because when I finished the book, I have the last part of the book gets more philosophical into the essence of life and in terms of, understanding what success really means. When I ask people today, what does success mean to you? It's very difficult for people to answer. You think it's a word that you can relate to, and you can say what failure is and what's not good, but it's very difficult to define what is success and who is successful. Because all of a sudden, when you take those metrics of money and gold medals, it becomes very static in the manifestation of the win, which is only temporary, right? So I discovered that the essence of the success that I also myself did not, see for many, many years was, to me, success is to experience progress. Um, And that accumulated over time has a compound interest to it. So when you learn to accumulate those small steps, it compounds into what you can manifest as, money, fame, fortune, gold medals, whatever. But it is the process, and that is, of course, very in many philosophies found as a path towards a fulfilling life. So that was to me a big part of this book. So there's various phenomena that we could get into, but one that is very typical for Norway is a word called dugnad. So whereas the Danish people have hygge, which was a very popular book on the coastal life of the
Yeah,
Scandinavians,
yeah, yeah.
we do have that.
The Finnish people have something.
The
I forget the
Danish,
word
yeah,
for it.
the Danish hygge, yeah, the Finnish also have, but
Yeah,
Finnish is it's a different, it's a different language. It's a little bit different than the Norwegian, Sweden, the Danes. They're up there with the Nordics, but they're not Scandinavians. So that's
yeah,
like a sort of, yeah, they're not Vikings, That's
yeah,
they are.
yeah.
But anyhow, so that was the Dugnad is that uplifting collective ethos in the community that you just show up and do something for someone else. And if you look at growth on an individual level and you say that when can you perform at your highest level, if you have the ambition to play, isn't it so that it's better that everyone around you play better? Coming back to growing up in my small village, if everyone in my team were better athletes and better performers, I could grow even more if that was my goal. And that holds for companies as well. And in companies, it tends to be hierarchical and you have roles, but it is like your path towards experience success seems to be better if you know that you can uplift. It's kind of sort of like a reinforcement learning model where you first uplift the community or the people around you so that you can stand out even more if you have that goal and you have that resilience and passion to go that path. So that became like a leading also I would say like a leading part of the book. And this word dugnad is very symbolic to how the Norwegian are. If it's a communal service or whatever, they show up for that voluntary work, but they don't see it as work. They see it as a part of just the way of living. And
Yeah.
that to me seems like a code that got um, set free, basically, that the Norwegian can go out with the self-confidence to say, I want to be the best in the world without leaving that ethical founding of the collective. And the unification or even maximization of individualism and collectivism, that is the fascination of the Viking Code at the deeper level.
I think this is absolutely fascinating. As you're talking here, one of the things that I'm thinking about, Anders, is currently in the United States, and this has been true for quite some time. I think there's been a tension, and you've lived in the United States, between individual success and group success. And what I hear you saying is the two are basically the same thing in many ways, at least in the Norwegian mind. And I think in the United States, there's this very, very, some people call it the frontier mentality or the Western mentality. It's about individual freedom. You talked about the Declaration of Independence, and there is, there's the Second Amendment in America. Everybody basically has a right to own as many guns as they want. There's free speech. It's really tailored towards individual rights. And sometimes I think we forget that we're all in this together, and we have too much emphasis on the individual. And like you're saying, oftentimes, in fact, most of the time, if you want to succeed, you're going to have a group of people around you to help you succeed. And so what I think about, I'm very much into Brazilian jiu-jitsu, and I think about the fact that when I go train, if all I've got is a bunch of inexperienced people there, it's going to be very hard for me to get better. I need people that are better, people that are worse. I need people that we need to be working together as a team. The more we work together as a team, the more we get good individually. So the team gets better and you get better as an individual. But I think this philosophy has been a little bit of a problem in America lately. The other thing I think, for example, a lot of people have read Ayn Rand, The Fountainhead, Atlas Shrugged, or something. This is this very, very muscular. All that matters is what you do for yourself. All that matters is the individual man. And then of course, you can bookmark that on the other side with complete and total collectivism. But
Mm.
I think somewhere in the middle the middle path, so to speak, is probably the sweet spot. So how do you encourage companies or people that you work with to adopt this Norwegian mindset? Because a lot of people, especially Americans, are like, me, me, me. What's good for me is good for everybody else. How do you encourage them to think a little bit more about the collective well-being?
Yeah, I think Brian, that's a very complex question. If I could play with it from a couple of dimensions, I would start off by taking that we seek for balance, right? But there is nothing like kind of sort of the equilibrium in life and in general. I think there is tackling ambiguities is much more symbolic on how our struggle is, and even I call it ambiguity tolerance plus, which is accepting the unknown. So it's not so much to have a balance of individualism and collectivism, but it's having both. And when I say so, it's more also in a Hegelian sense. People tend to misunderstand the deep essence of tackling the thesis and the antithesis, and then to have that understanding of also in this context in relation to and it's not even maximization of individualism, but a full focus on an individual growth path in terms of progress for you as an individual, and at the same time having a completely focus on a growth path, a progress path for the collective. So it becomes very evident when you go to your jujitsu that, if there's no one there, watching or playing or dancing or fighting with you, you understand that we are human beings only in relation to other human beings. So I am
Yeah.
because you are, right? So the Declaration of Independence becomes more, and I write about this also, a declaration of interdependence, where we understand that we can only rise above or we can only achieve something in relation to other human being if there is an interdependent relationship to this part or this community. And that, if you take that to a path of progress for humanity as a whole, it becomes self-evident when you understand the deeper implications of technology. So take a mechanism of communication where we have now maximized the return on our time through social media with a very dividing form of communication. Thumbs up, thumbs down. It's the instant reaction of
Yeah.
division. So we wonder how we are so divided when every reward mechanism in our daily life is a dopamine injection or the economic incentive of an instant reaction. So the instant reaction, the binary way of looking at the world, becomes our modus of communication. It's your opinion, my opinion, zeros and ones, right? And that
Yeah.
is how we just get more and more divided into the total collapse of the absolute. So we are held hostage or caught in our self-evident truth, if you like, and we cannot get out of that. And I think this is the path that we have been on. It was a very good path for 50 years, the way of optimizing the world, and it gained a lot of progress. Never have we lived longer. Never has less people died in wars, despite the terrible circumstance that we see in some places. Never has less people lived in absolute poverty, and so on and so forth. And that is something that we forget in our daily fight about how terrible things are and how. So this is how do we get that back into the mind of the people? And I think that the best way to approach this, coming back to your question, is not to build it on knowledge, to preach knowledge and try to enlighten people with your truth. But it's more so to build a society of understanding where you don't tell people what to think, but you teach them how to think. So it's obviously an educational challenge, in particular also in the US that we see today, that the common ground to stand on, the will to truth, if you like, has got lost. and there is no common ground to stand on. There is no, common strive towards a collective understanding of a situation, right? A plausible, self-evident, a justified true belief, if you like, that there is that the essence. And if the will to truth get lost in our collective journey, then it becomes obviously dangerous if we get all these technologies that just speeds it up and kind of sort of puts this dividing underlying mechanism on steroids. So I think the path forward is not to emphasize reflection, to reaction, but to emphasize reflection and not to tell people what to think, but teach them how to think. And AI could be a force that will force humanity to learn how to think, or it could be very destructive. So I think that is the path forward. And it was very interesting to see when all of a sudden a guy that, at least in Europe, no one had heard about, Tim Walz, come out of the state of Minnesota as a
Yeah.
Viking, having lived in Nebraska, as a coach, and basically just being normal in terms of reasonable in his arguments and having a coach, an inspiring, uplifting way of getting people activated and getting people into action and talking about the collective, but at the same time on the individual strive, but just also having some like normality to his views in terms of what in the past at least seemed to just be a normal quote unquote boring um, way of seeing the world. And I think that the path forward here is to work on that from an educational standpoint, to start to dig out some philosophical tools and to learn how to play together and to see progress, the common ground and the unknown and the collective path of progress as the essence on how we interact. And progress to me comes out of two things: friction and trust. And trust as a basis starts with the trust in oneself. So I have a self trust to go out and trust that there are other opinions out there that I'm open to listening to. And friction comes out of the possibility, the realm of talking about different views in a healthy manner. If that is given, then progress can follow. This used to be the coffee machine in a company, right? You had people working for
Yeah.
the same company, bumped into each other, had some ideas, talked about complex situations, and new ideas sparked. So that to me is kind of sort of in a bigger sense, what I think needs to be emphasized is to find that trust in that place for friction and play built on the understanding of progress, which is growing and learning and not destroying and controlling and postulating absolutes. So, yeah, it's a very complex question, but this is how I think about how we could have a path forward in these dividing times.
How do you, so when I reflect, Anders, on my formal education, it's heavy in two degrees that most people would consider practical: computer science and law. But my philosophy degree, I think, has been far more valuable than either one of those degrees. You could combine those two degrees. I think my philosophy degree has been more valuable. But there's this, there's actually a joke in the United States, and has been for a long time, that what do philosophy majors do for a living? They become philosophy professors, and that's the only thing they can do. And I think not only is that not true and hasn't been true historically, but I think we need philosophers even more now. And when I say philosophers, I mean people who know how to think, people that have a rigorous way of examining reality or propositions, and they know how to talk about all these different things. So, for example, and I've been saying this for quite some time, there are a lot of ethical issues that surround AI and large language models and computation and quantum computers. There are ethical issues that surround these things. And just because you own a company that makes billions of dollars and you're a good engineer doesn't mean you know anything about the philosophical implications of this technology. In fact, those two, being a good engineer and being able to build a product like a large language model, really doesn't have anything at all in common with being a good philosopher and being able to spot the ethical issues and speak intelligently about the ethical issues. So I think especially, and we'll kind of dovetail into artificial intelligence here. We'll kind of sneak over there into quantum computers. I think many of the biggest issues that face us today are not technical issues. They are philosophical issues. They're ethical issues. And we need people, Elon Musk, whatever you think of him, Mark Zuckerberg, whatever you think of them, they may be the world's best engineers, but that doesn't necessarily mean they should be telling us ethically how we should interact with these new technologies. They shouldn't be telling us, for example, and we can talk about this a little bit if you'd like to, there's all sorts of ethical issues surrounding artificial intelligence. So, there's security and safety questions. There's questions about what does it mean to be human. So if we get to the point, I think we've already blown past the Turing test for all practical purposes, and for people that may not know, the Turing test is Alan Turing, British computer science and mathematician. He basically set forth this test that if a computing system could pass it, for all practical purposes, it would be intelligent. But what happens when you and I are interacting like we're interacting right now, but it turns out you're not actually you. You're a computer generated avatar. So last week, here's another example. I took a document that I wrote, I put it into a Google program called Notebook, and it spit out a 10-minute podcast with two people talking about the notebook. I could tell the difference, but 99% of the people, if I just showed them this podcast, would have no idea that that was two computer generated voices talking and not humans. My point is, and there are ethical issues that surround what does it mean to be human? What does it mean to be conscious? Is individual consciousness important? These are all ethical issues. And I think they all fundamentally require philosophers. And in fact, for all of human history until recently, science wasn't divided into different groups. It was called natural philosophy. And the philosophers would pose the questions and then scientists would go answer them. So give us some practical advice on a kind of a meta level about how people can learn how to think and reason better.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, we could talk a lot about today the challenges in terms of science when it comes to the understanding of fundamental progress over the past decade or so. If you look at physics or the sciences, you even see that the Nobel Prize get awarded for old technological progress, and I've been saying for many years that expect a Nobel laureate for physics to come out of the corporate division, because that's where the money is, and they can do the same thing as in academia, only now they're working on products that are futuristic over time, and that's what's happening in a lot of these spaces, that a lot of these best brains in those fields are acquired by companies that have very deep pockets, and they give them the same playground to do their research and their developments. And so this is a very challenging time for those disciplines that we have been used to thinking about. So when it comes to philosophy, there is also a very strong need for philosophers that have an academic background to understand the economy and the implication of capitalism as an incentive system for climate, or for all these ethical challenges, that capitalism, the economy, is the working model of our society. And if it doesn't function, we will not have an ecological progress, and we will not have a social progress. So that these are also a deep understanding of how the economy and how an incentive for change for humanity is much more powerful sometimes than laws and regulation and limitations, because it gets very exhausting and you try to hack that. And on the other hand, you have the same thing with technology. If academic philosophers does not understand the potentialities of these technologies, now we are swimming on the surface of the most rapid change in human history. And the next 10 years is a technological tsunami, where if you don't understand the implications of the curve or the potentialities when the speed continues at the same rate, what does that mean? Then it's very hard to think about these questions philosophically, because it's so rapid. So it's not like a reaction of past happenings. It's
Yeah.
much more of anticipating near future, near term implications. And that is requires a lot of understanding, obviously, I think, about how human act and behave. And it does require a lot of understanding of the economy, and it understand a deep understanding of technology. But coming back to your question on how do you practice and train your mind to think in philosophical terms or have, philosophical contemplation, I think it starts out as a child where, and either all of us are philosophers or none, right? But
Yeah.
the essence is basically we get put into those categories, and the first thing we start to learn, we come to the world with an empty storage, and we are per se creative, we are explorative, we want to learn, and we have that interest for progress. And we understand that we have an infinite ocean of potential better ways to do things or explain things. And this is also coming a little bit back to David Deutsch's book, The Beginning of Infinity, and that was very,
One of my favorite books I've ever read. I
yes.
highly recommend it. Anybody listening looking for a great book, The Beginning of Infinity by David Deutsch is an absolute treasure of a book. But keep going.
Yeah, sure. No, I totally agree. And I think he is one of those minds that was at the intersection of philosophy and physics. And he understood very deep, very early, a lot of these implications and how things are, intertwined. And I had a very good conversation with him many years ago. And we had a night session on Skype. I remember he was eating his cornflakes and we were going on for 2 hours and talking about, and that was my, much earlier years in terms of consciousness. I was so and fascinated by his mind. And I think, how do you get that? I think, if you can develop curiosity. When I say curiosity, not like the playful only curiosity, but the interest. And if you are genuinely interested in life, which is basically to me learning, you get up in the morning. To me today, I'm really successful for me because I get to get up every day and learn. And
Yeah.
understanding that, that's the beginning of what I see as thinking. Because to me, when I write, I sort my thoughts. I spend time on sorting my thoughts. To me, writing is thinking,
It
and that's
is.
why I can see relations and I can see structures. So it's not very easy to pinpoint, but it's the opposite of reaction,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And that I think is something that you can there are many ways, there are many books on how to train your mind and cognitive experiences philosophy, but I think at a very simple, I like to take it down to that very basic start when we come to the world and we start to explore. If you can continue that path, and I did that throughout my childhood, then it develops automatically because you're starting to see different patterns. And um, we live today, it seems, in an era of generalists. So when you come back and talk about your philosophy degree, it is because you understand that everything that is related to knowledge, to data, is today a part of computation. And that
Yeah.
is true and has been true for the past 50 years. If you can continue the past, we will have infinite access to knowledge for free.
Yeah.
And the better it gets. So, knowledge, the whole idea of building a knowledge society and sorting information was from the beginning a short-term goal. And the deeper goal, it seems, is taking us back to Kant and Hegel and to build a society of understanding. And that, again, to me at least, and I think when you have that experience, when we get into consciousness, you have that experience of that fulfillment of fulfilling your life with intrinsically motivated ideas and goals to experience progress and growth, that leads you to a better understanding. And I think that is, having that toolbox of many things, you can see things is related and come up with those ideas and thoughts. So that's why I also got led into that a lot of the work with my friend Florian Neukert, who's a quantum physicist, but he's very interested in philosophy. And I am not a scientist, I'm not a physicist. And we started to write and think together. And I challenged him and 12 quantum physicists a night in Vienna 3 years ago, and I said, "Can any of you prove to me that we are not living in a simulation?" And they thought
I love it.
that should be doable. So Florian called me 6 months later and said, "Anders, I haven't slept, for months. I can't do this." So we wrote this paper, Are We Living in a Quantum Simulation? It's also going to be a book titled The God Experiment. So we are building on those ideas. And we, through observations and quantum physics and the limitations of physicality, we try to look at, how can you kind of sort of discover or hack the simulation or find observation that can prove that we are not living in a simulation. And it turns out that it's very difficult. I mean, we have the challenges with entropy, that an infinite simulation in a simulation would exhaust at the end. That's basically like the base criteria. But then there are ideas on how, to cope with entropy, and there are papers, and they're probably not very substantial, but at least I've seen ideas on how to halt or, play with entropy to that extent that maybe that is not even given, right? So these type of thinking leads us to a space where there are no limitations. There are nothing that is not achievable, and having that open mind where you can have a glass and you can drink out of it, but you can also relate to it to a bunch of waves that are tied together through some theory that is not, representative of how reality functions, because the general relativity and of an Einstein's thinking is not competitive with Newtonian physics and quantum physics that gets together, and we have all that various great ideas that are super complex, and everyone have their own set of field, and then there is another physicist debunking saying that's not how the world operates. So that, to me, to say that there is no one here that can explain to me the foundations of reality, and accepting that without giving up everything for God or having some kind of foundation. That, to me, is the deepest form of philosophy. And I don't need a stable ground to stand on in order to play with thoughts. And to get to that space, you just need to explore, and you just need to see the fascinations of all these great minds, all these giants that you are now standing on top of their shoulders and looking down and trying to figure out what the hell is going on. That, to me, is so fascinating. And when you challenge a fiction writer today to write a fiction novel or a script for a movie, what do you write about? If it takes 3 to 4 years to put it into life, put it into the market, so fiction has gotten so close that we are at the point where methodologies and folklore and enlightenment gets united into, it's not about is it possible, and that brings us back to where you started, is much more fundamental. It is, what kind of world do we want to create if we can build everything? And that is highly philosophical and challenging. And I think that's where we're moving. So we call it sci-fi, science philosophy, not science fiction. And we play at the outskirts of mind and matter. And that is very fascinating. And I think most people could get there if they learn and experience the fascination of growing through progress and learning. And I am still at the very beginning of this journey.
What an absolutely beautiful comment you did. I mean, there's so many things in there that I would love to explore. One of the things that I thought was so good about Deutsch's book, Power of, or The Beginning of Infinity, is, as I recall, he had basically two axioms. He's very, very parsimonious about what he thought was true and what wasn't true. And his two axioms, as I recall, it's been a few years since I've read the book, were essentially there will always be problems, and all problems are solvable. Given enough time, humans will be able to solve everything. And I find that incredibly optimistic. And I think that is kind of a broader way of saying what you're saying, the power of curiosity, the power of knowledge, the power, and like Deutsch says, Deutsch couches science and the scientific method philosophically in terms of philosophy. He says, for example, that the job of science is to provide better and better explanations. It's
Correct.
not to deduce things from data. It's not to use deduction or inference. It's to gradually have better and better solutions. I remember a passage from the book, Anders, where he writes, and it really struck me. He said, there were literally human beings that would go to bed at night and freeze to death sleeping on the very thing that could keep them warm, but they just didn't have enough knowledge. So our great ancestors didn't know about fire, and they would
Mm.
sleep on wood. Had they had a little bit of knowledge, they would have immediately solved the problem of freezing to death. And so Deutsch is really, really aspirational in terms of what humans can achieve. Essentially, every single climate change, ecological change, anything related to consciousness and physics and all that stuff is all ultimately solvable given enough time, because human beings will eventually have better and better explanations for these. In terms of I'm interested in about the simulated world phenomena, because as I recall, one of the things Deutsch said about pure virtual reality is if we had pure virtual reality, there would be no difference in what we call reality and virtual. Like they're essentially the same thing. I mean, if
Yeah.
everything is simulated, it's all exactly the same thing. I'd love to hear you comment on
Yeah.
on that.
First of all,
Like if I
yeah.
live in a virtual world and there's what does it matter that
Yeah.
I guess is my
But
question.
even today, I mean, even with the dumb, clunky worlds that we have created, the experience in that world is a real experience. So it's very
Yeah,
hard to argue that it's not real, right?
right.
But we just see that it's different than the perception of the world that we relate to as a physical reality, right?
Yeah,
Is that a representation, an exact representation? No, not at all. Is it a simulated reality? We don't know. Some argue that it's a very high likelihood that we are in a simulation. It's a very plausible argument, I think. It
yeah,
feels very real to me, but it is certainly not the representation of what we perceive, right? It's
right.
so there are many ways to look at what we call the physical reality. So I think also David Deutsch, I have detach myself a little bit from the finitude of a solution. So
Yeah,
I write about better problems. And the challenge in today's society, it seems in many points, is that we are looking for the perfect answer to the wrong question.
yeah,
And we are looking for those quick solutions, which is a very dangerous path to be on if we don't have any opportunity to react on the consequences. And AI, or artificial general intelligence, and moving into a singularity seems like a path where should have thought through a lot of things before we turn the lights off. Before we go off into the matrix, the last one turning off the lights. Should have thought about, is this the world we want to have? Do we want to create a world of philosophical zombies where we have the same, discussion and the lights are on, but there are no one home to perceive them, right? So
yeah,
this is
yeah.
something that I also write about. I title it How to Avoid the Zombie Apocalypse. And there are many dimensions to this. One is obviously getting sucked into those social media world. And there was a book by Neil Postman back in 1984. We are amusing ourselves to death, where he said the television is the worst medium. We're getting sucked into it. And television was nothing in comparison.
Aldous Huxley. I mean, Brave New
Yeah,
World
Brave
is.
New
I
World,
mean, Brave New
1930.
World is about a society where all of our needs are provided for, and it is it's not
That's
a
where
utopia. Yeah, it's terrible.
Yeah, that's where Neil Postman got his its foundation for the book also. And today we are amusing ourselves to death, and we're not having any fun, which leads us to that zombie apocalypse, because that's that's a new existentialist state. It's a state that I refer to as being undead,
Yeah.
and that is a new interesting thing to play with. And
We're
but
there now. We're there now, Anders. I would
yes,
argue, and I've talked about this quite a bit on other podcasts. We are there now. There's a great science fiction writer named Neil Stevenson who wrote a book a few years ago, and part of the book is about a nuclear attack on the Moab facility. I think it's in Utah in the United States, but it didn't actually happen. It was a social media construct, but everybody believed it happened. And in this society that Stevenson sketches out, a great swath of society have no individual agency anymore because
Yeah.
all they do, I think about the movie Wall-E. Wall-E,
Yes.
I think, is a profound philosophical statement on what
Oh
the
yeah.
future of progress could look like. And the problem with Wall-E and the problem with Neil Stephenson's book and the problem with Huxley and maybe even Postman is they sketch out these utopian societies that turn out to be hellish societies
Yeah.
because everything is provided for. There's no struggle anymore.
Right. Right.
There's no purpose. There's no mission. And
Yeah.
but again, I would get back to if you have a perfect representation of reality, then it is reality. Like, how is it any different? If it is a perfect representation of reality, then how is it any different than what we call reality today? In other
Yeah.
words, if I wanted to represent playing baseball with my kid, if I could represent every single subatomic particle and the feel and the touch and the smell, and I couldn't distinguish, how is that any different from reality? Like, how does it even matter that it's not, quote,
Yes,
real,
that
right?
was the yeah, that was the chopping on the tip. We said that that's the essence. So
Yeah,
it doesn't matter,
yeah,
because if this is a simulation, Brian, it cannot take away my experience of the experience. It
yeah,
feels like something talking to you. If this is some 14-year-old boy that puts some, physical boundaries and laws, and maybe even at the at the foundation of the game itself, is to figure a way out, it doesn't change anything. Because if you find your way out, what are you then in the second simulation or a different layer, or what's that outside of the simulation? There are so many questions to that. So
yeah,
it doesn't matter. But what matters, I think, is that you experience. And there are many ways to cope with these absurdities and the challenges, and God and having a belief is obviously one of them. Myself, I don't I have great respect for everyone that has a subjective belief system. I don't think religion is necessarily the way to go, but having belief, I think, is for many people to cope with these, crazy and times hard and complex struggles. I think that's very helpful. I don't need to go into that because I accept these strange things that happens. And I was just recently in Göbekli Tepe. I don't know if you're familiar with Göbekli Tepe. So
no,
Göbekli Tepe is on the border to Syria and eastern Turkey, and it's the cradle of humanity. So we were taught about Stonehenge as the first civilization. You talked about, how technologies, and we were gifted two thumbs and we could create stuff. That was 6,000 years ago. So Göbekli Tepe is 12,500 years ago. So it's twice as old, and it's much more fascinating than Stonehenge. And this was dug out in the mid-90s by a German archaeologist. He found something on the surface of this region in the middle of Mesopotamia, and he started to dig. And they have dug there for 30 years, and they have only dug out 10% of Göbekli Tepe, which means a dick stomach. Underneath, you find huge 6 meters tall stone T pillars where you have 3D engraved animals. You have representations of astrophysics, and you have the sky and the various positioning of things that have happened on this planet that seems to be a warning of some kind of some lost civilization. There are so many theories. No one knows. But the interesting part here is when you stand there, and you look at this era and you get the feeling that they have only taken out 10%, and everywhere you dig, you found something new, something absurd. And then you travel an hour and a half into nowhere and you find another site, and they have 60 similar sites in the region now to the new technology that they will dig out. And you come to a place where in a room, there is just a lot of phallus. So penises basically formed a stone, and there's a phallic man, and there's a phallic man standing holding the phallus in two hands. rising 5 meter tall, and they find a calendar with 365 V's graved into the stone. And they were
Wow.
12,500 years ago living in a civilization lost for humanity, where they had technological knowledge of build the complex stone structures. And you see this phallic man, and you see rooms, and you have no idea who they were, what they did, and no one has figured that out. You just realize, this vitality of life, the experience of that is so fascinating. I flew back then to Istanbul, and I go into the restroom, and I stand there, and I look left and right, and I see two young men of the modern type that are undead, that are those philosophical zombies, holding their phallus with one hand, because in the other hand they were zooming and scrolling Instagram while taking a pee. You ask
Yeah.
yourself, 13,000 years of evolution, what the hell do we know? So
You know,
that's
I used to that I love that. I used to I used to think I used to see people staring at their phones, and in my view, the information flow would be like if you could see it, if you could visualize it, the
mm,
information flow would be going from people's eyes and their brains into the phone. Now, when I see that, I see the opposite. I see
yes.
this little device programming all these undead zombies essentially and that's why I get to the point where I think right now for good or for bad there's broad swaths of our societies that have no individual agency because it's been co-opted by technology, cell phones, things like that. I mean, when you think about it, it's really not a fair fight. I mean, we've got billion-dollar corporations with thousands of engineers versus your little tiny brain. They're going to win that most of the time, which is another reason, by the way, by having a philosophical mindset, I think is so important. I have 3 kids. I tell my kids one of the most important skills you're going to have over the next 10, 15 years is being able to determine what's bullshit and what's not. And most information is pure garbage. I mean, it's just not useful. And so being able to pick the signal from the noise is becoming harder and harder and harder. I've kept you for a little bit longer, but I really want to, I want to delve in. Do you have a little bit more time? Because I'd like to delve
Sure,
in.
Brian. Yeah, we were in. I was also linking it back to what you started to think about with the reflection, and also when you say to distinguish, who is the one to tell the truth then, right? I mean, there's
Yeah.
there's no problem today to run algorithms that can falsify statements in real time. Having a
Yeah.
political debate to have that falsified. But what does it matter if you don't believe the falsification mechanism? Who is the one that tells the truth? And as you
If,
see that in the US, right?
yeah, if there's not a joint reality, like if we don't have
Exactly.
something we agree on,
The
then
will to truth.
the will to truth, then it's hard to get agreement on anything. Well, I'm going to ask you a very, very broad question.
Come on.
What's consciousness? What do you think consciousness really is? And
Yeah.
and when I say that, I don't mean that on a superficial level. I mean like, so to me, that if you want to talk about what it means to be conscious, when I think about being conscious, what I think about is having an inner experience, essentially, like having an individual inner experience, having a self-reflective experience. That's kind of descriptive of what consciousness is. What I'm really super duper interested in is what is there doesn't appear to be any evolutionary purpose for consciousness, number one. And number two, how does it arise? In other words, is consciousness a function of the way that our individual brains are structured and the way it works, or is it substrate independent? In other words, could you build a conscious machine? Would consciousness arise out of some sort of arrangement of atoms and silicon and stuff like that? So,
Hmm.
how do you think about consciousness? What do you think consciousness is? It really is.
Yeah. Over the years, I've gotten really, in many days, I have this, I sympathize with consciousness as a concept of foundation of Lebendigkeit, vitality, what it means to be a mensch, a human being. Um, I like that. It romanticizes an experience of the wonders of nature, or the simulation or whatever. So I like that idea. Um, Donald Hoffman talks about consciousness being fundamental and reality emerges out of consciousness. You have all the panpsychist view. You have various theories. Um, Tononi famously, have a very idea of called phi, where everything is conscious, where the information processing gives rise to complex systems, and they arise to complexity or the higher grade of consciousness, and high pi is then basically a experience that can relate to a human type of consciousness. So there are many ideas, um, I think Nagel wrote in his book, how does it feel like to be a bat? It is that
Yeah.
exactly feeling of what something feels like. And David Chalmers, has claimed or coined the hard problem of consciousness, which has been basically over the past now 30 years, one of the foundations when you think about consciousness. And David Chalmers has very many interesting ideas on to take on those various layers. Um, but I think,
Is Chalmers the one who essentially, I maybe miss Gödel Bach was written by Hofstadter. Am I thinking about that right?
yes,
Which
but
he basically thinks that consciousness is a result of kind of regressive loops in symbolic loops in the brain that ultimately
yeah,
form this.
so Chalmers came up with the concept, the hard problem of consciousness. What do we think with the problems? The easy problems, where there are also complex problems, obviously still. That's the functions of the experience that are related to the mind.
Yeah.
But the essence of the experience itself, what does it feel like? The smell of strawberry, or even the
What is it like to see the color red?
Yes,
Like
exactly. And
stuff
or
like
you're
that. Yeah.
cutting yourself in the finger, you know you exactly what that refers to with a paper cut or
Yeah.
something. So that is like the theory of that many follows, and I'm very sympathetic with that, and I think Chalmers is a brilliant mind in that field. When you look at it from a technology standpoint, one could argue that once we hack biology and chemistry and understand, everything about the physical reality, and that is probably not very far away. If we have strong computers, we can simulate at least any atom in our universe, and then basically we could go down that path of computational reality. And once we understand biology, what follows is that the structures of how to rebuild an identical human being is achievable. So that means that if we have an identical Brian and Anders, would this entity then automatically have consciousness, right? And that's the question. Is it in the realm of physicalism, or is there something outside of what is physical achievable? And even if we say that for the sake of the argument, it is not within the achievable, within physicalism, then still it does not hold us back from replicating the representation of consciousness, and also maybe giving birth to a simulated consciousness. So Florian and I write about this in the Singularity Paradox. We write about artificial human intelligence, where we also argue on how to build artificial conscious entities, where one argument that could be reasonable in terms of complexity and a reasonable path to follow would to be to figure out how we could consciously build a conscious robot.
Yeah.
So if the robot would behave similar to a human consciousness, which in general seems over the past at least 100 years by rapid population growth and complexity, to figure out somehow, by all due respect, not perfect, but in a decent way to have progress. There have been terrible wars, there have been a lot of things, but in general, we could say the direction has some path that is um, possible to be positive, to be better. This is also what I refer to as possibilism. What are potentialities that we could follow? And human beings seem to have that capacity. So if robots would have that, and we would take some of the human flaws out of it, maybe that would be a good place to be in together with machines. But again, what also follows is that once we start to merge with technology and we figure out how the neurons are wired, and we have already seen some of the first examples of that with Neuralinks and others. And you take a broader subset of the neuron. Let's just, for the sake of the argument, I know this is way out of where we are today, but if we have 10,000 neurons and we know how they operate, and we have 100,000 neurons, a million neuron, a billion neuron, we get all the way up to 83 or 84 or whatever billion neurons, and we have understood the wiring of the electricity of the firing of the neurons in a computational way. We have rebuilt the brain. Do we then have a mind?
But have we? Have we?
No,
Because
yeah,
I would
yeah.
argue maybe from a classical physics standpoint we have, but from a quantum perspective, have we really done that? Because so one of my working theories, Ray, I'd love to hear your comments on the following idea. So one of the kind of, and I'm not an expert on quantum mechanics by any stretch, but one of the ideas in quantum mechanics is it's a probabilistic way of looking at the world, whereas relativity and Newtonian physics is more black and white. And so one of the things that quantum mechanics says, and I'm going to say this at a very, very high level, hopefully it'll make sense, but you can't determine. So the act of observation changes the state of what you're observing, essentially. There is no specific state until there's an observer. So, and then once you observe it, you can't determine with precision both location and velocity at the same time. Because if you know the location, you don't know how fast it's moving. If you know how fast it's moving, you can't determine the precise location. So I think there's a lot of similarities between the way the human mind operates and the probabilistic way that quantum phenomena operate. And let me give you a very concrete example of that. I've been a meditator for a very long time. And one of the games that meditators play is they try to observe their own thought process. And you can get to a point, if you meditate long enough, where you basically lose the sense of self. You lose it. But the second you observe it, it reappears. You change the state. So when you observe your own consciousness, it behaves like a quantum. The act of observing your own consciousness changes your own consciousness. And so I think human mind, that my working theory is the human mind is a quantum system. And we, at least right now, can't build a physical quantum system because because it's a probabilistic system. Does that make sense?
It makes sense. And so first of all, there is I don't know if you're familiar with the concept or the theory of microtubuli.
No.
So you should look that up. That's Roger Penrose, and he was playing with the mind from that concept, and he bumped into a I just forgot his name. The one of the leading thinkers in that field that has it's microtubuli, and he's an anesthetist, and he's working with Roger Penrose on that microtubuli. So let me see. So I would got to get his name to get this right. So Penrose and trying to can cut this out, shorten it down a little bit. So yes, where Stuart Hameroff, of course. So yeah, so getting back. So there's a concept for microtubuli. So Roger Penrose was looking at the mind, and he got in touch with a anesthetist, Stuart Hameroff, and he has been working on something in the brain. So in the neurons, he has discovered something that he referred to as microtubuli. So those are quantum phenomena in the brain. And that was from a scientific community said, oh, that's not possible because the brain is a wet, fluffy thing that does not get to stabilize quantum effects. And, it's not, it could not be. And over many years now, and you go to these conferences and talk about the science of consciousness conferences, you come and talk about the microtubule. And Hameroff is, very well, respected, and Penrose also, of course. But a lot of physicists say that this is obviously not true, and others are very, sympathetic with it. And this is a very, an idea that resonates with what you're saying. So the quantum phenomena in the brain, so there are basically a quantum computational function in each neuron, so to speak.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that makes the brain a quantum computer. And I like this personally because it just takes up that way of seeing the world. And in quantum theory, you have the Copenhagen interpretation where there is observer and the collapse of the wave function. It manifests into a new probabilistic wave, and that is basically requires a observation apparatus. There needs to be something that that does that, right?
Yeah.
And there is also the many world interpretation of Hugh Everett, and that has also become very popular. I think Sean Carroll, that is also having that view of the world that
David Deutsch too. I think David Deutsch is
yes,
a
David Deutsch is
big,
also
big believer.
sympathetic with
Yeah.
the many worlds interpretation. So that every world divides by every collapse of the wave function. There is a division, and there's a new reality that is inaccessible to us. And this world gets into millions of different worlds where we are. At the collapse of the wave function, on the one world we met our wife, and in the other world we didn't. To make a very simple path,
Well,
and
in one world we met her and she said yes. In one world we met her, she said no.
everything
And
is
once
that
there,
cost,
and everything in
cost.
between. Yeah.
Exactly. So these are all interesting theories that I like to listen to, and I don't think there is anywhere near a conclusion to that. So I like that because that leaves us with that non-explicable phenomena that we cannot really explain what the brain is, what the mind is better. So we can represent the functionality, so we can play with it, just like quantum physics. Even though we don't know the foundations, we could build things on it. So we can play with the brain on the functionality level, and we could tap into the function and restore sight and hearing and all that, and we can know how the brain operates, but we don't get the essence of the mind. That I
Yeah.
like, because if and only if, I think, if we have that journey, that infinite path of better explanation or better problems or progress, if that is given, if we know that we are human beings and we don't know what we are, as long as that questions remain unsolved, we have a journey, we have a conscious path to proceed. And that, to me, is very much the foundation of life. It's a wonderful journey to nowhere. And as long as there is a journey to experience, then I think we're in a good space. If we discover everything and understand everything, then obviously we could rebuild it. And then basically we are a computer, which again takes us back to then we are a part of maybe a simulated reality because we could rebuild it, at least in theory. So I think that is very much a part of the beauty. And I like to think about consciousness as like one part of that. Could you just call it magic for the sake of the argument? And I think the brain, there is nowhere near an explanation that the brain is a quantum computer because it's obviously not uh, related to how we try to build quantum computers, and it does not follow the laws on how quantum computers are. But there's been a great progress in trying to come up with ideas on how to build other ways of quantum computation, and maybe eventually we will get to some space where something like the mind. But again, if we would figure out how that would operate, then it takes us back to the theory of physicalism, where we could again rebuild everything. So this is basically the idea that Flora and I have written about in the book, that we could build some kind of artificial conscious entity that behaves exactly like a human being. And then it comes back to what you said earlier. It doesn't make a difference if you
Doesn't matter.
it
Yeah.
doesn't matter. If
Yeah.
you are behaving exactly like a human being, and you make me laugh, and or I meet my wife and she's a humanoid and I fall in love with her and she gives me goosebumps and everything, it doesn't matter, because that's the essence, where you get into that representation layer, that I can never tap into your consciousness. I can only speak from
Yeah.
a subjective experience standpoint. And as long as that it feels real to me, then it doesn't matter. But I am very romantic about the mensch, the human being. And as I said before, I think as long as there is a journey of discovery of what we are, I think we're in a healthy place. As long as we know that there is still progress to be made and we can experience that, then we are a part of the Lebendigkeit, the vitality of life, the magic of the ordinary, where you can travel to a distant island in Norway and you can go outside and you can listen to the silence and experience that as something special. Um, and that's magical.
That's the perfect ending to our conversation. That was one of the most profound things I've ever heard. So essentially what I hear you saying is the fact that we don't know everything is part of what makes the experience magical. It's part of what makes life worth living. I read a book during quarantine by a Dutch philosopher, and he had a similar argument. He said being immortal, living forever, would be one of the worst things that could ever happen to anybody, because you would have no reason to do anything ever. And it's the same thing. If we knew everything, if we had knowledge of how everything worked all the time, maybe it wouldn't be quite as good as we thought. It's good that there's still unanswered questions. It's good that we have a limited time to answer these questions. It gives us a reason and a purpose for being. Well, Anders, I knew this was going to be a really, really good conversation. I hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. I had a absolute blast talking to you. Well, I know for sure we could talk for hours and hours about all these topics, but I just want to say what a great conversation. You are a very deep thinker. More importantly, I think you're thinking about the right things in the right way. And so I really appreciate you being on the show, my friend.
Brian, thank you so much for having me. This has been a great conversation. I really like listening to your thoughts, and thank you so much for having me, and thank you for your warm words. Very much appreciated. Thank you so much.